Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the 7th lecture for muscle physiology. In this lecture, we'll talk about what a motor unit is in a muscle and talk about the characteristics of a whole muscle contraction. So to start off, let's just consider the fact that whole muscles need to be stimulated by motor neurons. So motor neurons innervate muscle cells, and a whole muscle is innervated by multiple neurons. For example, there's an estimation of somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 motor neurons in the human tongue. So there's a lot of muscles in the human tongue, but nonetheless, that's a lot of motor neurons. And about 440 motor neurons innervate the human biceps brachi. So multiple motor neurons can stimulate a whole muscle. A single motor neuron innervates several muscle cells known as myofibers. The myofibers in a motor unit are spread throughout an entire muscle. So what is a motor unit? A motor unit is a motor neuron and all the muscle cells that it innervates. Notice in the picture to the right, we have two motor neurons innervating this particular muscle. Obviously there's more. This is just a schematic diagram. There is one muscle cell, one myofiber, that's actually innervated by both motor neurons. So a nerve impulse traveling along either axon will stimulate that particular cell. So as I mentioned, a motor unit is defined as a single motor neuron and all the myofibers it innervates. Now, motor unit size can vary, and it varies by how many myofibers are innervated. For example, in the diagram to the right, the motor unit labeled number 1 is smaller than the motor unit labeled number 2. Motor unit number 1 is green, and it involves a single green motor neuron and innervates 2 myofibers. The second motor unit includes a red motor neuron innervating 4 muscle cells. So they vary in size. How much do the motor unit sizes vary? By lots. Some motor units only innervate 10, 5, maybe 10s like 20 or 30 myofibers. For example, the extrinsic eye muscles have the smallest motor units. A single motor neuron will only affect 5 muscle cells. There are also large motor units, which I mentioned before, that there's just so many motor neurons innervating whole muscles. But large motor units could affect thousands of myofibers. One example of a large motor unit is one motor neuron affecting cells in the gastrocnemius muscle. That's your calf muscle. In that case, a single motor neuron innervates 1,720 cells. Now it's important, I think, that you realize that a whole muscle, be it the gastrocnemius or an extrinsic eye muscle, probably has multiple motor unit sizes. Definitely multiple motor units. And those sizes could vary. Now, what is the functional difference between a large motor unit and a small motor unit? Well, large motor units of course, can generate more forceful movement than smaller motor units can. Therefore, muscles that we use for weight bearing and activities that require a great deal of strength have more large motor units. For example, the gastrocnemius we use for forceful movements. It has many more large motor units than small motor units. Small motor units, however, do have an advantage. They allow for fine controlled movement. They do generate less force, but the movements are more precise. For example, the muscles in our fingers and our extrinsic eye muscles that help us look in certain directions have small motor units, many more than large motor units. Our next topic is going to discuss the characteristics of whole muscle contraction. And before we look at how a single cell would respond to a stimulus, let's first think about the whole muscle contraction. Then we'll look small scale and then big scale again. So a whole muscle contracting develops tension. So we call this muscle tension. And muscle tension is the force that a muscle must exert in order to contract. And that force is going to have an opposing load. It's the resisting force exerted by the weight of an object on a muscle, for example, a bone. So when the muscle contracts, you already know that it shortens. And the muscle tension, in order for this muscle to shorten, it has to accumulate over time. So if you look at the graph at the bottom, after stimulation, tension builds, takes some time for that. It reaches peak tension, and then the muscle relaxes. So this picture that I'm showing you of the graph is called a myogram, and it's a recording or a tracing of muscle tension generated over time to move a specific weight. And this is done in a laboratory, so they apply a certain object at the end of a muscle, measuring it in kilograms, and then look at how long it takes the muscle to reach peak tension. If instead we're interested in looking at why it takes time to build tension, we usually in the laboratory look at individual stimuli. So we just stimulate a muscle once, and then we measure what kind of tension builds. So this is called a muscle twitch, and we record a myogram in response to a single stimulus. And when we do this, we notice there's 3 phases, which isn't completely surprising because there's 3 phases in the whole muscle tracing as well, no matter how many stimuli there are. But the 3 phases include a latent period, a contraction period, and a relaxation period. The latent period, or the time it takes for a muscle cell or a whole muscle to develop peak tension, occurs because first stimulation has to occur, then the muscle cell is depolarized, then the sarcoplasmic reticulum has to release calcium, and then finally actin-myosin cross bridges will begin to form. That all happens during the latent period when tension is building. By the time the muscle reaches the contraction period, there are numerous cross bridges happening simultaneously. They do release and reform in different locations, but the maximum number of cross bridges will form. And so this tension maximizes. Then, when relaxation occurs, the calcium has to be resequestered into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. ATP has to bind to myosin to break the cross bridges. So a twitch just happened in response to a single stimulus. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole muscle is going to contract. This is really only seen in a laboratory setting, this twitch, because most of the time we have more than one stimulus traveling from a neuron to a muscle, either in frequency or maybe one neuron frequently stimulates a muscle, or maybe multiple motor neurons stimulate the muscle. So normally in whole muscle contraction, if we were to do a tracing, we would see a graph like we looked at before, where the contractions are smooth and graded. We call this tetanus, when a muscle can reach peak tension and sustain it for a period of time. That's referred to as muscle tetanus. So the muscle tension overcomes the resisting load and the muscle shortens. And we need these normal, smooth, graded contractions for proper control of our skeletal system, because that's what's being moved, are our bones. Now there are variations in the strength of a whole muscle contraction. That's why we say that it's a graded contraction, meaning that the muscle responses vary depending on, one, how many motor units are recruited and how big they are. Two, how much stimulation there has been in terms of frequency. Three, how strong is the stimulation, meaning how many motor units and how well the muscle depolarizes. And then four, the strength of the contraction can also depend on what was the resting length of the whole muscle before contraction began. So we're going to look at each one of these items and find out why they affect the strength of muscle contraction. So I think the first one's pretty straightforward. If you recruit more motor units, you're going to affect more muscle cells. You will stimulate more muscle cells. So we see this graph on the bottom showing the tension that develops when maybe 2 motor units are recruited, or maybe 5, and on and up and up and up, right? So the more motor units recruited, the more muscle cells are stimulated and the greater the force of the contraction. Another way we can increase the strength of muscle contraction is by increasing the frequency that we stimulate the muscle. So what we looked at when we looked at a muscle twitch is shown in this first upper left myogram. It shows a single stimulus and, yes, contraction, but it's probably not completely tetanus. It's probably not maximum force. But nonetheless, the tension declines, and then time separates the two stimuli, and you get another little twitch. If we increase how close together these two stimuli occur, they add, they summate. And so you'll see that now we've got in the same amount of time, we've got 4 or twice as many stimulations, and so we can develop more muscle tension. This is basically how our neurons work. They send multiple neural impulses to a muscle so that we get maximum muscle tension sustained. We call this tetanus. So high frequency stimulation causes a sustained contraction. And we don't really truthfully ever see this picture on the right, fused tetanus. It would be very hard for the muscle to relax. There's usually a little blip in there, here and there. But in a laboratory setting, you could attain that kind of stimulation frequency and get a fused tetanus. Okay, the third thing that affects the strength of muscle contraction would be increasing the strength of the stimulus, but this just means we're recruiting more motor units. It's not really any different. How strong is the stimulus, meaning are we recruiting large motor units or small motor units? Are we recruiting multiple motor units or fewer, right? And that's going to depend partly on anatomy and partly on which neuron fires. So there's something known as the size principle. When a muscle contracts, usually small motor units are recruited first, and then successively, I can't think of the right word, sequentially, larger motor units are recruited over time. This is called the size principle. And your textbook talks about it with the diagram I'm showing you here, but I think that this diagram is a little bit more straightforward. So this describes the size principle and motor recruitment. So the order of motor unit recruitment is that first small motor neurons and small motor units are recruited. So notice here in the spinal cord, X labels a neuron that has a small cell body, not very many axon branches, and therefore is not affecting very many myofibers. But they're recruited first. Then the next thing that happens is medium-sized motor neurons are recruited, so you get more muscle cells involved, a larger motor unit, and then finally the largest motor neurons and motor units are recruited. And so if you look at the graph on the right, you see the force of the muscle contraction that corresponds with each stage of recruitment. So for example, the small motor unit, it doesn't develop a lot of tension, right? But then we add a bigger one and we get an amplified, exponentially amplified amount of tension, and so on and so forth. Now this might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but actually it allows for fine controlled movements. So sometimes you don't need a lot of force to do the movement that you need to do at that particular time. I also wanted to mention that along with the fact that the size principle involves the size of the motor unit and the motor neuron, it turns out that muscle fiber size also varies. And we see that smaller muscle cells are recruited first, and then medium-sized, and then larger sized. Now there's a little bit of debate about this. Okay. It's often confused when people talk about the size principle. They often assume that that refers to the size of the muscle cell, like I'm showing you here. But really, the size principle has to do with the size of the motor neuron and the motor unit. But they correlate because most small motor units have small muscle fibers, and most large motor units have large diameter myofibers. So it kind of works out to be the same thing. So I just want to backtrack for a minute so that you can see where we're at and you don't get confused and think that it's too complicated. First, we're just talking about how contraction varies in strength, right? How we can get different strengths of contraction. One is by recruiting different motor units, or more or less, or small or large. Second, we're talking about changing stimulation. How frequently does the neuron stimulate the muscle, and how strong is that stimulation, which really relates back to how many cells are you affecting. So the last thing that we're going to talk about has to do with the resting length of the muscle prior to contraction. So I'm going to go back and we're going to talk about the last topic, which is how we can get the best or the greatest tension. What's the ideal sarcomere length to produce the greatest muscle tension? It turns out we need the muscle to be slightly stretched in order for the sarcomeres to be aligned in such a way that there is an overlap of all the myosin heads with actin. That's approximately 80 to 120% of normal resting length. If actin and myosin overlap too much, you're not going to get sliding, like if the actin was already all the way over here, right? If it's too stretched and actin and myosin don't overlap at all, then the myosin heads can't bind to actin. So let's look at the difference. So this is a normal resting length, okay, to get maximum tension. And we see that all the myosin heads overlap with actin. That's right in the middle. If instead we stretch that muscle more, which you would think, okay, if I stretch it more, maybe I'll get a stronger contraction because I can pull the actin filaments further. But it turns out that's not true because not as many myosin heads start out being in contact with the actin. So the muscle tension that you could develop would be much less. It would be much weaker, like 25%. Likewise, if the sarcomeres don't completely reach the relaxation length and instead stay partially contracted or shortened, again, we're not going to have proper overlap of the actin-myosin filaments, and even though myosin is in contact with actin, there's nowhere to pull it. So there is an ideal length of sarcomeres, or an ideal stretch length to develop maximum muscle tension. So this slide just shows a summary of the factors that can increase the force of skeletal muscle contraction. So one, I added this one. This is from your textbook, but I added this one. Multiple motor units recruited. That would definitely increase the contractile force. And if we recruit large motor units, you're going to affect more muscle fibers. More muscle fibers will be recruited. That's the same thing in essence, because you'll get the same increase in contractile force. And it turns out that large motor units have large muscle fibers, So the larger the muscle fiber, the greater the force. If we stimulate more frequently or have a stronger stimulation, which really is all this stuff, then we'll increase the force. And if we have a slight stretch to the muscle before it begins contracting, that will increase the force of the muscle contraction. So that's all for lecture number 7. There's one more lecture for the semester, and then you'll be done. Thank you.